Well, I'm making it just about 4 minutes past kind of 11. We were to kick off kind of at 11. Welcome everybody for joining us for this Cockburn Conference on this 30th of kind of January, this mixed Saturday morning across the country. And welcome to this event, which we've called Whose Festival Is It Anyway, which is an exploration of a whole range of kind of issues with a mixed panel from artists, from cultural organizations, from festival organizations and tourist things, to in this really difficult time of COVID where everything has been slammed shut, that it provides kind of that opportunity for us to just have kind of a conversation about some of the kind of issues and the future directions going forward. And really that's all I'd kind of want to say. So on behalf of the Cockburn Association, kind of welcome everybody. And in particular, I'd like to kind of welcome our kind of first panel for the morning, just to kick straight into it. And just before I kind of do so, just to kind of note that for the attendees, this is a webinar package, so you'll be kind of quite a passive audience, but please use the Q&A and chat functions on your panel that you can see to kind of input, and you know, if I can ask the panelists to just monitor that, because there'll be absolute gems of thoughts coming in, and I'm sure that they'll contribute enormously. We'll capture kind of all of those going forward as well for part of any proceedings document that we might produce. We are recording this so that we'll upload the document, the film, up on our YouTube channel, so you can go back and visit it. And of course, we are broadcasting live on Facebook too, if you dip out and just want to kind of capture it as you're going about that way during your day. You know, for those of you who, you know, I have to kind of put in the message as well, that if you're going to be tweeting, please do use the hashtag EdFest, which is one I certainly know that the Edinburgh Festival's kind of use, so why don't we kind of build on that conversation going forward. But there's also the Cockburn at the Cockburn, which you can kind of put in too. So without any further ado from me, because I'm not the reason why you're here attending, let me kind of introduce our panel chair for this morning. We're absolutely delighted to have Joyce McMillan, who I'm sure is known to kind of all of you. Is theatre critic for the Scotsman, but also kind of writes about political and social commentary, you know, for the newspaper. Is a long-standing kind of a journalist with huge credibility in the subject matter of cultural matters and the arts. And we're just absolutely delighted to have Joyce chairing the session. So Joyce, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, what a kind introduction. Thank you very much. And I'm very, very pleased to be chairing these two morning sessions. I think there are some brilliant questions asked in the programme for these two morning sessions. And of course, we have great panellists as well. This first one is called Founding Principles of the Various Festivals and Development. When was Edinburgh at its best? What lessons should be relearned for the future? And so this is an invitation really to look back at the origins of Edinburgh's festival in the years after the Second World War, Edinburgh's festivals, I should say, in the years after the Second World War, and to see how far the aims of the founders, if you like, or the principles on which they were founded are being upheld, how far they're being betrayed, and what those ideas were in the first place, and are they, you know, those founding ideas fit for purpose for the 21st century. And we've got the most fantastic panel here to help us discuss this. Really the dream panel, I think, on this subject. Our first speaker is going to be Dr Angela Bartie. And Angela Bartie is a tremendously respected historian of the life of post-war Scotland. She's currently a senior lecturer in Scottish history in the School of History, Classics and Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh. And in 2013, I mean, she has done many, many studies into different aspects of Scottish society in the post-war years. And in 2013, she published the Edinburgh Festivals, Culture and Society in Post-War Britain, which is the first major academic study of the origins and early years of Edinburgh's annual international festivals. So it's wonderful to have you with us, Angela. We're also later going to be welcoming Morvern Cunningham and Helen Martin, and I'll introduce them later on. But Angela, would you like to open this discussion with some thoughts? And I mean, I'm sure you could speak for many hours on this subject, but with some thoughts on the questions that we're addressing in this session. And thank you very much for being with us. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Joyce. I guess most people will know that the festival really came out of the Second World War. And the first meeting at Edinburgh was pitched as a venue. Oxford was the original choice of Rudolph Bing, but the first meeting that Edinburgh was pitched was back in December 1944. And it was the British Council Scottish representative, Harvey Wood, who suggested Edinburgh as an idea. And Bing had actually been to Edinburgh, and he'd noticed the castle on the hill had a Salzburg look, and so as a sort of venue in an amphitheatre, he saw that it had potential. So there was all sorts of press releases talking about the idea of setting up this new Festival of the Arts, and the Second World War really shaped it in a number of ways. And one of the really important ways in which it shaped it was, and I think it has some interesting parallels with now, given what we're going through in the context of COVID, was the idea that culture could be this amazing healing power for, you know, civilization. Like after going through all these years of war, that culture could be the thing that brought everybody back together again. So you see that coming through in all those sort of initial discussions and the press release. And I sort of picked out a couple of quotes to help sort of set the scene, I guess, of the original kind of founding principles and the ideas around the festival. So the first one is what the Lord Provost at the time, John Falconer, said at a reception prior to the opening of the inaugural festival in 1947. And he said, "This city may become the cultural resort of Europe, where men and women will find a haven, not merely to hear and see, but to be quiet and respond to a life of spiritual and intellectual refreshment and inspiration." So it was this idea of Edinburgh as the city and the festival, like more broadly, and in culture in the sort of broadest sense, bringing lots of people together and helping to heal the wounds of all of the many years of war. But at the same time as really setting out to put on a festival that brought together the best in the arts from around the world, there was also a lot more practical considerations. And I think that's going to come through all of the discussions today and all of the debates around where the festival is now in the 21st century. And that was the issue of the sort of economic factors, and especially in relation to tourism. So in May 1947, a journalist for the Edinburgh Evening Dispatch tried to remind readers that they weren't on some sort of cultural mission, and that the enterprise, in her view, was not for Scotland's cultural enlightenment, because Scotland just couldn't afford to organise such an expensive cultural treat for herself, but argued instead that the real purpose of our festival is to provide a good draw for visitors in the shape of what they want to see and hear, not what Scots think they ought to. And she summarised the hard fact basis, as she put it, of this new festival. And I quote here, "With no cultural aces of her own to strengthen her hand, she is scooped to pull, become a #1 centre in a paying commercial line, the commerce of culture." And the reason I wanted to sort of highlight those two is that these sort of tensions and contradictions have been there in the festival from the very start. There's the high ideals, there's the importance of culture, there's the importance of the arts and of putting on like a showcase, you know, and thinking about culture in this really pure and really sort of this kind of important sense, and thinking about it in terms of I guess well-being, mental well-being, spiritual well-being, to use a term of the time. But there's also the more pragmatic side of it. In these years after the Second World War, obviously the British economy is pretty ravaged. There's a real importance to try and provide some sort of injection of funds into the British economy, and this is when you really see tourism as a strategy beginning to take off. And there's a voluntary Scottish Tourist Board that's founded in 1946 the same year we have the Arts Council of Great Britain founded, and at the same time as the festival's being developed. So all of these things are coming together around the same time. So I think that's all I'd like to say, just in sort of opening up some of the ideas. I can expand on any of those, or bring in some of the other kind of discussions around the festival or features of that first festival, but those seem to really speak to me in terms of some of the themes that are coming out today.
Yeah, before we move on to Morvern, Angela, can I just ask you, looking back to that early time, how at that time do you think people would have answered the question, whose festival is it anyway? Whose festival was it when it was founded?
Well, it just so happens I've got a couple of very good quotes in relation to that. And I think this one is particularly good because it really captures some of the debates that are still live now. I mean, we're many years beyond the first festival. We're in a very, very different society. So many changes have occurred in the years since the festival was first set up. But this is an extract from a letter that Mary Glasgow, who was the Arts Council Secretary General, wrote to the manager of the King's Theatre in Edinburgh, who was a member of the Festival Society and involved in the programme committee. And she asked of the festival in this letter, and I'm going to quote it, "Is it to be British, so far as this country's contribution is concerned, or mainly Scottish? Is it to be Scotland acting as host to distinguished foreign artists and giving them in turn the best that Scotland can offer? Or is it to be Great Britain acting as host, with Edinburgh as the chosen seat of entertainment?" So all those questions were there when the festival was being developed. Obviously, it's like they were really significant because in that first festival, there was a concern that Scottish theatre was being excluded. And really, you could argue that that's what provoked the development of the Fringe with Glasgow Unity and their real challenge to James Bridie and to the festival organisers. And that set the tone for me as a social and cultural historian. What drew me to looking at the festivals was I see them as a lens or as a space for exploring a lot of these broader debates about not just who's the festival for, but who's culture for, who decides what culture is funded, who decides what's in the programme. And I think it's interesting for me as a historian to see that a lot of those debates that were there when the festival was being organised in those early years of its development are still very, very live today in a very different society.
Yeah, so at the very beginning, there were these two forces, which was a group of artists who knew nothing really about Scotland or Edinburgh, but just saw it as an arena in which a festival which would present what was at that moment received as the best of European culture would happen. And then there was the council and that particular visionary Lord Provost, John Falconer, who saw an opportunity and a chance for Edinburgh to emerge from the wartime as something more than just a kind of battered provincial capital, you know, as a global festival city in its own right. That's fascinating, Angela. Fantastic. Right, now we're about to move on to Morvern Cunningham. Morvern's an independent creative producer based in Leith. She's got over 2 decades of experience of working across the arts in Edinburgh and Glasgow. And she's the founder and trustee of the multi-arts organising as a charity, Leith Late, based in Leith, and now in its 10th year. In 2020, Morvern published a groundbreaking manifesto for how the city of Edinburgh can build back better in a post-pandemic world, entitled "You'll Have Had Your City," which is a very good title and suggestive of all kinds of questions about who's had what, including their tea, out of this these years of festival growth. So, Morvern, how would you begin to answer these questions about the origins of the festivals and whose festivals they really are?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It was really interesting listening to Angela as well, and just talking about, I feel that the pandemic has kind of brought to light and amplified an awful lot of questions, and these questions around who's the festival for, who is art for, what is the primary outcome of art, and even just those contentions that you were talking about, Angela, between well-being and the economy are stuff that our governments are struggling with in the pandemic about how to actually deal with it, and actually weighing up economy versus well-being, and sometimes making kind of very wrong decisions as well, obviously. And I think it's just really important to be thinking at the moment about, you know, as individuals, as organisations, as a culture sector, as a city-wide kind of strategy, you know, what are we doing this for, and who are we doing it for, and why are we doing it? What's the purpose? In terms of kind of the origins of the festival, I can't hark back that far. As Joyce mentioned, moved to Edinburgh 2 decades ago to be a student, and I've worked across the festivals each year, and worked across venues in the festival as well. And then when I started Leith Late, which is as Joyce says, a multi-arts charity in Leith, I think a lot of people at the time, 10 years ago, were going, you know, why are you doing stuff in Leith? I mean, you know, what's the point of doing something in Leith? And it's been just such a surprise focusing on my local community and my area, and kind of seeing the festivals from afar, and seeing how the festivals really don't permeate Leith and other parts of the city at all. And it just seems like a really strange manifestation that has happened. And from what I can tell, in the last 5 years in particular, there's been this kind of growing resentment against the festivals, and a bit more of a, there was always a little bit of the residents going, oh God, here comes the festival again. We're not going to be able to, you know, get across the city. We're not going to be able to use the buses anymore. Here comes the circus in town. But there's been some kind of really kind of growing concern over like some serious challenges and questions that are happening in the city year on year. So yes, the strain on local infrastructure. We've seen like growth in Airbnb, house prices and hotel prices going up extortionately. There's questions around kind of takeover of public space in the city every year, and then the pricing out of artists and audiences being able to actually afford Edinburgh in August. So you talk about kind of when the best time. I mean, I remember when I first came to Edinburgh, and, you know, working at the Fringe and working at different venues, and also being a stage manager at Fringe Sunday, and kind of some of these amazing kind of experiences that just felt free, open, accessible. People would come into the city and feel like an ownership over it. I don't know kind of where the messaging has come, where there are people in the city that don't feel that the festival is for them. That's something to do with money, it's something to do with affordability, but it's also to do with messaging. And it's interesting because actually the festivals, through Festivals Edinburgh for the past few years, have actually been issuing information on box office data. And we know actually from box offices that, you know, 40% of the income that Edinburgh International Festival makes, for example, are from EH Edinburgh postcodes. So they're hugely important to the people of Edinburgh. The people of Edinburgh are going and supporting the festivals, but there is a growing feeling that actually they're not, it's not for them, it's for other people, it's the tourists that are coming in. And even the conversations about what's going to happen this August, it's kind of like, oh, it's an encouragement to bring other people in, but what about something for the people of Edinburgh? In terms of like the historical stuff that I know about Hamish Henderson's People's Festival, obviously, which kind of grew up in response in some ways like the uninvited Fringe members. It's a kind of response to programming and messaging that they felt wasn't for the people of Scotland and for the people of Edinburgh. So this has been, contentious from the very start, as Angela mentioned.
Thank you very much, Morvern. That's really fascinating. Of course, Edinburgh has lots of festivals, and here I think we're focusing on the August festivals, the Festival and Fringe, the Tattoo, and all the huge kind of hyper tourism that goes around that. But as you've demonstrated with Leith Late, it is possible to organise festivals that do have a more popular feel and sort of fit in. Feel more owned, shall we say, by members of communities in Edinburgh. And I just wonder whether you think there are any examples, apart from Leith Late, of festivals that you think do a better job, or at the moment are more kindly viewed by the people of Edinburgh. I mean, the Children's Festival, the science festival, which is quite popular with families. You know, do you think these things have got a kind of better model going than the big August festivals?
I mean, definitely. I mean, I think it's very easy just to say the festivals, and really, yeah, as you say, people are talking about EIF or the Fringe. For me, actually, an example, I mean, to take it out of Edinburgh, of a festival that I think is really doing it right in terms of balancing the kind of local, international, is Celtic Connections, where it's a festival that is of the city, is born from the city, is proud of its city, is proud of its of its artists, and its artists are put on a pedestal along with all the international artists that come along. And there's a lot of cross-fertilization and great things that come out every January in Glasgow. But there's definitely some festivals that I would say are more integrated in the city. The Jazz Festival, for example, I think is one.
Yeah. So it's worth bearing these models in mind, but of course probably the August festivals are always going to struggle to have that image because they didn't really come out of the creative life of Edinburgh. They were like a sort of gift from the world to Edinburgh, which was you know an amazing thing. But it's quite an unusual way really for such a major cultural event to emerge. So I suppose even now, as you've both said, we're still dealing with the legacy of that. Now we're going to move on to our third speaker, who is Helen Martin. It says here, Helen has been a journalist from almost half a century. Well, I'm afraid I could
indeed.
Makes us sound like as if we're terribly old, but we're not, of course. We're still
no, of course not.
And Helen has worked in many roles in journalism, particularly at the Edinburgh Evening News. She was a features editor, associate editor, communications manager for Scotsman Publications. Now she is supposed to be retired, but doesn't seem very retired, and is still writing her regular and much loved column for the Evening News. So Helen, you've watched the evolution of the festival down a good few decades now, and I just wonder how you would answer some of these questions. You know, how do the origins of the festival still impact on it today? Do we need to move beyond those ideas, and whose festival is it anyway?
I think initially the fact that the festivals were based on culture and artistic performances and all sorts of things. They tended to be held in specific places, which that was fine. And I've been living here now for working for over 30 years, living here for 30 years. And when I go back 30 years ago, actually the festival was, not the festival, all the festivals were attractive to most people, I think. But what happened over the years was that culture almost was in some cases put to one side when all other sort of things started happening in the middle of Edinburgh, in the centre. Edinburgh is a huge city, but the city centre is really quite small, and that's been taken over by all sorts of aspects of added to the culture. Everything from the fact that you know, we can have fairgrounds next to the Scott Monument, 4 million tourists coming, sometimes for the festival, sometimes for holidays, ever. But everything is very much concentrated now in the city centre and not in cultural places like theatres and you know, cultural display areas. So what's happened now is that we want to keep festivals. Everybody wants to keep festivals. They're so important for Edinburgh. But in the city centre, anybody who lives in the new town or the old town is being, to be honest, slightly abused by things like generators, you know, humming outside their window during the night, and their roads being closed so they can't have deliveries. And Airbnbs, as Morvern said, you know, all these different things coming in. And I think that's why up to 2019, things have actually gone become slightly very offensive, in fact, to some people. And the irony really is that nobody has anything to applaud COVID-19, but the fact that COVID has caused this issue for coming August, that festivals are being completely reconsidered. They're being considered to be held out of the centre of town, whether it's in Inverleith Park, Saughton Park. And the result was from the International Book Festival, because rather than being in Charlotte Square and the sort of chaos that caused, especially if it was raining, it turned into a mud heap, etc. They have now decided in future, whether there is a festival this year or not, that it's going to be in which is a cultural venue for a cultural festival, which is lovely. But at the moment, I think that there still has to be a lot more management and input from the council, because that has changed over the years. When you look back at the council originally, or in the early days when the festivals were set up, the council seemed to be involved more in culture. Now the claim is it seems to be important because it brings in millions and millions of income, hundreds of millions. But I saw Professor Haig's lecture for the Cockburn Association, and it turns out actually that the tourist element that gets involved in festivals isn't one of the greatest earners for Edinburgh City. So I think sometimes the council perhaps is pushing too much that way and should perhaps be going back the way it was before, really looking after and working on behalf of the electorate, the people who the council is meant to be providing services for, and yes, maintaining and keeping the festivals, because we need them and they're nice, but they're highly entertaining, and they make a great reputation for Edinburgh, really, around the world. But they have to be coming back to culture and away from other things that are added to festivals, such as international markets in Princess Street Gardens, which wrecks the gardens, or huge concerts in Princess Street Gardens where the fences are walled up on Princess Street so that nobody can even glance into the gardens, never mind go down there and use them. There needs to be more for the people who are living in the old town and the new town, and the council really has to, I think, work more for the public. But I'm a huge supporter of festivals.
Thank you very much, Helen. Yeah, I don't, well, I think there are very few people in Edinburgh who just want to see the whole thing end. You know, I don't know, perhaps we should discuss that a little bit. I mean, obviously it was incredibly important to Edinburgh's post-war development that it began to be seen as a festival city. I think we could probably agree that, but does it still need to be seen as a festival city? I mean, you know, that's obviously taken for granted by the council, all their strategy documents, you know, setting up Festivals Edinburgh to promote the festivals and all that. But I mean, do we think that Edinburgh still needs to be seen as a festival city in the way that it, well, or in any way, never mind the way that it did back in the 1940s. What do people think about that? I mean, is there any case where just
I think
go?
As I say,
I think better off that it would be yes, considered as a festival city rather than an over tourism city, for one thing, and that it's the difficulty. The difficulty that it gives to Edinburgh is the fact that everything is concentrated in the centre. Edinburgh is a huge city. But the centre, because it's historical, architectural, it's most buildings are preserved. Yes, we have a palace, we have a castle, we have parliament, we have courts, we have everything. It's a hugely important capital city, and the centre is full of all these things. But it's also full of residents, and it's a tiny centre when so much happens in the centre. I wish more happened in Leith. I wish more happened everywhere round about. And that way we would all love it, and the centre would not be so overtaken. And that would be fine if it was in a theatre, if it was in another cultural depot, but not to take over public spaces and cause problems for people who live in the centre. So I certainly wouldn't want to see festivals go. I'd want to see them spread around. I'd want to have more festivals that are perhaps Scottish, Lothian festivals, yes, but I do think that there just needs to be that this COVID thing has ironically led to rethinking how to hold these things, which is good.
Morvern, did you want to say something about that, about the festival?
I was just saying it's vital. I mean, arts and culture is vital to Edinburgh. It's vital to us. It's vital to humanity, as Angela was saying. I mean, as we come out, hopefully, of the other side of this global pandemic, there is going to be a great need for healing. Artists are the way that we communicate our trauma and heal from this. And for me, it's that great pause, as Helen says, we have. For me, and it's something that I mentioned in the You'll Have Had Your City piece, is that I felt that the strains and challenges and the kind of imbalances that were occurring in Edinburgh in the last kind of 5 years were taking it to a point where something would have happened anyway. And now we have this fantastic opportunity to rethink how we want to have arts and culture in our city, and how we want to integrate, and how we want to cater for our citizens and for our visitors. I do think, though, in terms of what Helen said about public spaces, I think that for the short term, at least, and actually probably for going forward, we need to be rethinking how arts and culture relates to public spaces, because we all know that outdoors is much, much safer. And actually, as I mentioned, things like Fringe Sunday, bring back Fringe Sunday, bring back ways for people to engage and interact with cultural activity for free, or pay what you can.
Yeah.
So I think Angela's going to say something as well.
Yeah, I mean, I often think that the levels of irritation expressed over something that, when all's said and done, only lasts 3 weeks, and it really is only 3 weeks now since the Fringe and the Festival began once again to be at exactly the same time. I don't think that the actual inconvenience would bother people so much if they felt more served by what was going on, and more connected to it. It's the idea that it's just not for them and it's causing them inconvenience is the thing that seems to be causing the...
I mean, the one caveat I would say, though, as well, is in terms of Edinburgh being a festival city, and it should be, and as I say, it is, I think there's some discussion around the competitive nature of Edinburgh being the premier festival city in the globe. This concept of thundering hooves behind you, and this politics of competition. And again, I'm hoping that as a result of the pandemic, what will actually come out of it is more collaboration, more concern and care, and of course less competition.
Of course, I think the problem with talking about the festival running for 3 weeks is the fact that that's the festival and Fringe, but there are other festivals building up around Edinburgh. And if you look at, for example, now perhaps people wouldn't call this the same thing, but it is often referred to as the Christmas and New Year Festival.
Yeah.
You've got the Book Festival, which is now that is in August actually, but there are different festivals and things happening, which are not the nice cultural festivals you're talking about, and they're happening over more of the year and adding, I think, to such a massive number of tourists. Now, is there an element when we're looking at the people who live in the centre of town and whose lives really are sometimes, cause problems to? I mean, should we then be thinking about how to move things out of town, or how to cut down, not cut down tourists, but how to deal with over-tourism? Is it the tourists that are irritating people who live in the centre of town, not the festivals? Yeah. Or, is it the combination that it's a big thing to manage when you put the two things together?
I just want to, we're kind of running out of time. I just want to give Angela a chance to say a word about that, the festival city idea. Do you think it's still important, Angela?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I mean, I think it's, Edinburgh has provided the model for so many of the festivals in so many different ways. Like, it was different because it was a multi-arts festival when it first started. The Fringe, has like inspired all sorts of other festivals around the world, and a whole kind of experimental and kind of provocative approach to the arts. But I want to wave a flag a little bit for Glasgow, because a festival I've been exploring a little bit more recently is the Glasgow Mayfests. And I think a lot of people have kind of, they sort of get forgotten, but in the mid-1980s, they were actually really biting on the heels of Edinburgh. And it was because they were seen as very successful as being a festival that was really for the people of Glasgow and really reflected people in Glasgow, as well as having that international element. And it seemed to, I mean, there's all sorts of like debates and politics in there that I've been exploring, and there were some challenges to that, but it really spread the festival out. There was, the events took place in all the outlying housing schemes in Glasgow, and it really tried to be as participatory and inclusive as it could. And I think, it's a shame that it died a death. It was 1983.
Yeah, it was
went away in 1997. It died, and I think I'd love to see something like that resurrected. And it's the comparisons with Edinburgh that I found really interesting when I'm looking at the contemporary sort of press coverage of that. That people were saying, like, Edinburgh should learn from this. Glasgow is getting this not perfect, but it's getting it more right than Edinburgh is just now. So
Glasgow's International Festival of, was it Radical Theatre and Music or something like that? That was its strapline, and it was really powerful. The combination of sort of grassroots Glasgow work and internationalism. And I think it was a good balance to the Edinburgh Festival. It meant there was a different type of Scottish International Festival to measure Edinburgh against, and I miss it terribly, and I still miss it, although there are a lot of Celtic Connections, of course, has come to fill that gap in some ways. I'm just, before we have to end this session, I'm just looking in the chat. I've been trying to read it as we go along. Lovely comment from Andrew Ormston, who says, framing it as tourism versus culture is of the moment. And I mean, that's a real tension. But for many of us, it's a personal history where we had first encounters with astonishing art that shaped us, Pina Bausch, Robert Wilson, etc., etc. The Fringe was where some of us learned our trade, stage managing, lighting and producing. So yeah, I mean, we hear a lot about the negatives of the festival now because of the sort of over-tourism crisis that we've been through, but thank you, Andrew, for reminding us of the huge, I mean, it's incalculable what things they have seen in the festival have meant to people and what things they've been able to do in the festival have meant to people over these 75 years.
There's also a question I don't think anyone will be able to answer at the moment in the Q&A from John Wilkinson saying, will we have a festival this year? So,
well, we don't know that.
It's too soon to tell.
I think we can confidently say we don't know the answer to that. Yeah, another question about the concentration in the city centre, which is something we maybe need to unpack a bit more. Why is that happening? Why has it become an event so concentrated on the university venues in the south centre of the city, actually? Because now with the book festival moving to the School of Art, it's retreating completely from the new town. You'd hardly know there was a festival on in the new town now, never mind down in Leith or, you know. I mean,
is it something to do with the university? It'd be interesting to know.
Yeah, exactly. Perhaps these things need to be unpacked. Edinburgh International Film Festival is hugely popular and owned by Edinburgh folk. That's true, although there's still debate about whether the film festival did the right thing by moving out of August and back to June, I think. Some people liked having it on at the same time as the other festivals and found it more buzzy.
I think the kind of the conversations around concentration are simply not going to you know, be relevant in COVID terms, though, because we won't be able to have a concentration of people in places. It will actually have to be spread and spread out, and that will just be something that has to come out of COVID, is that we need to have more space. Everyone needs a bit more space.
We've also got comments about the pressure on public space in Edinburgh and public space being turned over for what are perceived as commercial operations, you know, in deals between the council and particularly Underbelly, but other professional operators, people calling for a new report. And of course, Anne Packard raises the question of whether a lot of what happens in the fringe is really culture or whether it's just students messing about. And that, of course, raises the question of why the fringe has grown so big. I mean, when I was first covering the fringe in the early 1980s, I think it was about less than a fifth the size that it is today, and yet it was still pretty big. So, I mean, the fringe has reached a point where it is so huge that actually you can hardly talk about it. Any generalization you make about it is going to be wrong, because somewhere in some other part of the fringe, something entirely else is happening, you know. I mean, yes, there are a lot of students just messing about, but there's also some absolutely astounding work, but the scale of it has just become so overwhelming that a lot of people are just, you know, are at a loss to know how to approach it. So that's another issue arising for the future. Right, we're sort of out of time, but I'm going to give each of our wonderful panellists time for a quick final comment. Helen, do you want to add anything on any of these subjects, which will doubtless be coming up again throughout the day?
I think just on the last thing that you've said, that's quite right. I think we really have to consider both, as Morvern said, and I'd mentioned about COVID as well, that spreading things out, perhaps not have things that are just too big, like the fringe.
The fringe when it's an open access festival, you know.
Well, exactly, and the difficulty is how can these things be reduced at all? And that's a very big, important piece of management for both festivals and the council together to find a miracle answer. But if they could find that, I think everybody would be far more supportive of all the festivals, because they need to be supported. But you can understand if somebody's life is being you know, flown up in the air over summer, it becomes unpopular.
Yep, hyper fringe and hyper tourism have sort of come together.
Yes.
There's no doubt. Angela, do you want to add something before we finish?
I guess I just wanted to, it hasn't come up, but I think Andrew Crummey will talk about it in the next section, is the fact that there is a model as well for how local community in Edinburgh, you know, along with what Morvern's doing now, can really sort of say, well, actually we have this amazing wealth of talent in our local area, and we're going to showcase it in this festival. And I mean, the community art side of things is something that, it's a story that you know, Lucy Brown's written a bit about it. It has to get out there, like just the amazing work that community artists did in the 1970s, 1980s into the 1990s. And you know, obviously Morvern's like at the forefront of that kind of work now, in terms of really working with, you know, people in their own communities and getting involved in that grassroots activism, not just in relation to cultural production, but, you know, the kind of spin-offs and the influence and impacts that then has on other aspects of people's lives.
Yeah, yeah, there's something there I think about too that we'll probably need to discuss further, about the relative economic weakness of local authorities compared to where they were in the 1980s and 1990s, when they were able to do initiatives like Mayfest and Glasgow 1990, and in Edinburgh all sorts of things were supported. And Helen was saying how much more proactive the council used to be in the cultural field, you know, rather than just trying to encourage tourism. But I mean, the fact is that councils, I don't appear to have the resources and the confidence that they had back then. And I'm sure, you know, you could support that with numbers. I just think they've got no money, basically. Morvern, do you want a final comment on that? Or
there's so much, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more to talk about today. It's great that the chat's going on fire, so I'm excited to read back through some of those. But I think for me, it's, as I was saying, it's about kind of redressing the balance. It's sharing power. It's about amplifying marginalised voices of all kinds that are within our city. It's about having these kind of conversations and about having the right people around the table. So it's not just those people in power, in economic power, in cultural power who are making the decisions. It's also, you know, platforming our artists, our independent self-employed freelancers and our residents, and having a conversation and visioning about a better Edinburgh that is more equitable for all of us, really.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. A city for the people at last. It's a very complicated city, Edinburgh, but also a very beautiful one, and still, we hope, a festival city. Okay, well, listen, thank you very much for an absolutely brilliant first session. We can't see our audience, but I'm going to give you a round of applause. Applause for all the speakers, and a big thank you to everyone who has put questions into the chat. It's a difficult way of communicating, and I wish we could see you all and talk to you all, but we'll try and keep an eye on the chat throughout today and make sure that most of the points that appear there get some kind of discussion. So thank you again. Thank you so much for that opening session, and we'll be back at noon with session number 2. Thank you so much, Angela, Morvern and Helen. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joyce.
And thank you, Joyce.